G'day legends, and welcome to part 2 of Adventure King's FAQ, getting into four-wheel driving. Now if you haven't seen part 1 yet, do yourself a favour and click that link in the top right corner. Watch my mate Khan's video, 12 volt Q&A questions answered. It's an absolute cracker and it's full of excellent information. So this time around, I wanted to talk four-wheel driving, getting into four-wheel driving, choosing the right four-wheel drive, the modifications you need, and if you stick around to the end, I'll tell you the 5 things that I would not go four-wheel driving without, plus 5 things that I would definitely leave at home or not worry about spending my money on. Now before I get into things, do me a favour, take a second, hit that notification button and the subscribe button because we are hammering our channel with excellent camping, four-wheel driving and 12 volt camping videos every single week, and I don't want you to miss a thing. So question 1, let's start with the basics. What four-wheel drive is right for me, especially if you're just starting out? The truth is, if you've already got a four-wheel drive, then the one that you got parked in your driveway right now is probably an excellent starting base because you're probably already one step ahead of someone who doesn't have a four-wheel drive. It doesn't really matter what it is. You can learn the basics, you can make mistakes. If you find that it's not right for you, well then you can move on to something else down the track. But if you haven't got a four-wheel drive yet, then generally speaking, I always recommend as new as you can afford and as low Ks as you can afford. And we'll touch on that a bit more in a moment, that new versus old debate when it comes to four-wheel drives. But generally speaking, if it's newer, if it's got lower Ks, it's gonna be more reliable, and reliability is absolutely key. Trust me, there is nothing worse than spending every single trip on the side of a track trying to fix something that's always seeming to break. So a couple of my picks of second-hand four-wheel drives that are great to start looking at if you're just getting into four-wheel drive come down to 2. If you're looking for a wagon, then I highly recommend an early Generation 3 Pajero. So that's around the early 2000s Pajero. They've got a 3.2 litre diesel motor. They're independent suspension front and rear. They're never gonna be as good as a big patrol or a big cruiser in the seriously hard stuff, but they'll be a beautiful touring machine. They are surprisingly good in low range. And the best part is that you can pick one up for round about the $10,000 mark with around about 200,000 kilometers on it. I reckon that's an excellent bit of gear. Now, if it's a ute that you're after, and heaps of people love dual cab utes, I think they're fantastic myself. I think one of the best value dual cab utes out there at the moment is a early D4D Hilux. So we're talking something around about 2005 to 2009, something around that era. They've got the 3 litre common rail motor. Now they did have some issues with injectors. The injectors do need doing every 100, 150,000 Ks. If you're looking at buying a second-hand one, just find one that's had those injectors done. And if they've been done, that's gonna be a really reliable, excellent four-wheel drive. And the best part about both that Hilux and the Pajero I mentioned a second ago is that parts are plentiful, parts are cheap. You can get them just about anywhere. Every parts store's got parts for both of those four-wheel drives. And that brings me on to my final point when it comes to choosing a four-wheel drive. If you can, do yourself a favor and stick to one of the more popular brands, Toyota, Nissan, Isuzu, that sort of stuff. Because at the end of the day, things are gonna break on four-wheel drives, things are gonna wear out, it's just the nature of it. What we do, what we put our four-wheel drives through when we head off-road is a little bit outside of the manufacturer's specifications and what they envision for the four-wheel drives. And the last thing that you wanna do is have a four-wheel drive that's sitting off the road for a month while you're waiting for a part to come from Japan because it's not kept in Australia. If you stick to one of those more commonly purchased, more common, more popular brands, you're lessening that chance of those dramas happening. Okay, so question number 2, new versus old four-wheel drives. Now it's a bit of a commonly held misconception that older four-wheel drives are always gonna be more reliable than newer four-wheel drives. I think that misconception started probably 10 or 15 years ago when vehicles started coming out with more electronics in them. And as four-wheel drivers, we've always been a bit wary of electronics because the theory is the more complicated a vehicle is, the more things there are to go wrong when you're out bush. But I don't think that's really talking about the whole picture. So going back to what I was talking about a moment ago, about buying a vehicle that's as new as possible, that has as low Ks as possible, that fits within your budget, what we're talking about here is the fact that as a vehicle ages, every single component on that vehicle ages too. If you've got 250,000 kilometers on the clock, that's 250,000 kilometers that every single component on that vehicle has done. Brakes, wheel bearings, engine components, suspension bushes, all are wearing items. So that's why I highly recommend buying the latest model four-wheel drive that you can afford with the lowest Ks on it. Even if that means having to buy one with a lower trim spec, It might not have all the bells and whistles, it might not have leather seats and plush carpet and dual zone climate control, but the truth is you don't need any of that stuff to go four-wheel driving, and in many cases all that stuff is actually counterproductive to four-wheel driving. I highly rate buying a four-wheel drive that has vinyl floors, because trust me, when it's muddy, it is so much easier to let that mud dry if it's inside the vehicle and just brush it out off a vinyl floor than to pull the carpet out and gurney it off, put everything back together. And in terms of new versus old four-wheel drives, even a newer four-wheel drive at a lower trim level is almost always going to be more comfortable, more capable off-road than an older four-wheel drive. So when it comes to an old versus new debate, I'm definitely in the new camp. Now that point was really driven home through hard-learned experience with me. About 4 years ago, I did a trip around Australia in an old 80 series Land Cruiser. Now when I set off, it had about 350,000 Ks on the clock, and it was somewhere around the 22-year-old mark. And in my head I thought, I don't want to buy a new four-wheel drive for the trip around Australia and have that new vehicle payment. And I figured this old four-wheel drive, I know it inside and out, it will be reliable. And the truth is, in the money that I spent, not on accessorizing the vehicle, but just on mechanically preparing the vehicle for the trip, and then the repairs that I had to undertake on the trip, I spent $15,000 in 12 months on repairs. Now that would have easily paid a year's worth of new vehicle payments, so it was something that I definitely learned the hard way, and that's why I'm definitely in that new four-wheel drive camp, because I genuinely believe the lower the Ks, the more reliable the vehicle. Okay, so question number 3 is a debate that rages around every campfire in Australia: ute versus wagon. Now I've had heaps of both over the years, so I reckon I've got a pretty well-formed opinion on this topic. And I really reckon that you just can't go wrong with a ute, for the obvious reason that you get so much space in the back, whether you have a tub or if you've got a canopy like I've got here, and that translates to more space to haul all your gear. It also means heaps more ability to customize your setup to your own needs. I've done a bit of a walkthrough on my ute and how I've set it up, so I've put that link in the description. That's just my setup. There are so many different ways that you can set up a ute. And utes have come a seriously long way over the last decade or two. Going back 20 years, utes were agricultural things that were just rough, they were noisy, they were slow. If you jump in a modern ute, and when I talk modern, I mean anything built in the last 10, 15 years, you'll be seriously surprised at the fact that they're powerful as a wagon, that they're as comfortable as a wagon. The road noise isn't really that much different to a wagon. Now, I don't mean to alienate anyone who has a wagon, because I've had heaps of four-wheel drive wagons over the years, and they are awesome bits of gear. But if you are looking at this debate from the perspective of buying a four-wheel drive, then I really don't think that you could go wrong with a ute. Okay, so question number 4. What gear do I need to go four-wheel driving? Now, if you're just starting out and you've got a completely standard four-wheel drive, then here is the number one thing you should be carrying at all times to go four-wheel driving, and that is a good recovery kit. Because the truth is, getting stuck is just a part of four-wheel driving, and in fact, if you've got recovery gear, it can actually be a fun part of four-wheel driving. But if you're out bush and you get stuck and you don't have recovery gear, then you're just going to send your day very much south. Now, leading on closely from a recovery kit is a tyre deflator and an air compressor. Because when you go on four-wheel driving, you need to be able to lower or adjust your tyre pressures to suit the terrain. Generally speaking, the lower your tyre pressures, the more traction you get because your tyres mold around the terrain. And again, I know I'm hammering you with links, but click that link in the top right corner for a cool video that I've done previously showing the real world differences between various tyre pressures on beaches. But beaches aren't the only place that tyre pressures are important. Whether you're out in the hills, doing long range dirt touring, tyre pressures are vitally important. So when you go four-wheel driving, you lower your tyre pressures. At the end of the day, you need to pump your tyres back up, because the last thing you should be doing is driving on deflated tyres on the tarmac. They will heat up, they will burn themselves out from the inside out in many cases. You risk a blowout and you risk ruining your expensive tyres. Now, while I'm on the subject, let's just talk tyres for a moment more. Have a look at the tyres that are on your four-wheel drive or the one that you're looking at buying. What you're looking for, ideally, is an LT designation on the side of the tyre, and that means light truck construction. There's a big difference between a passenger construction tyre, which is what most four-wheel drives come with from the factory, and a light truck construction tyre, which is substantially tougher. You don't need the gnarliest, chunkiest tread out there. You don't need mud terrain tyres. All-terrain tyres are definitely going to be chunkier than a road terrain tyre, and will do a really good job of the mix between daily driving your four-wheel drive around town and giving you some pretty good traction when you're out in the bush or on the beach. So the big difference between a passenger construction tyre and a light truck construction tyre doesn't just come down to the tread pattern, but more so the construction and the toughness of the sidewalls in the tyre. A passenger construction tyre is much more likely to sustain damage, even on light dirt roads, whereas a light truck construction tyre is made of much thicker materials, is much tougher. Now, if you're looking for a tyre that's going to do it all, I really suggest a set of all-terrains. So to sum up, the gear that you need, the very basics to go four-wheel driving, some good recovery gear, an ability to deflate and re-inflate your tyres with a tyre deflator and an air compressor, and the next step is I'll be looking at some good tyres. So question 5 is another age-old debate amongst four-wheel drivers. Do you need diff locks in your four-wheel drive? Now, many modern four-wheel drives come with a factory rear locker, and if you don't have one, then there are definitely aftermarket suppliers out there where you can purchase them. The thing is though, they aren't a cheap modification. Expect to pay somewhere around the $2,500 mark per diff supplied and installed for a diff lock. Now I'm going to say something pretty controversial here. I don't think that's good value for money for most four-wheel drivers. If you're pushing your four-wheel drive to the absolute extreme, yeah, they are awesome bits of gear. What they do is lock both tyres on a single axle together so they turn at the same speed. And that prevents that situation off-road where one tyre loses traction and it spins while the other tyre doesn't do anything. Now, the thing that is really tricky about diff locks is if you don't treat them with respect, you can actually drive yourself into way more trouble with a diff lock than you can without one, because if you don't have diff locks and you get bogged, generally 9 times out of 10, you're not that bogged, you're just losing a bit of traction. But if you've locked 2 tyres on that same axle in and you get yourself bogged, you're probably pretty seriously stuck. And that can mean the difference between a little recovery and one that is just an epic 4, 5, 6 hour mission. So if you don't need diff locks, what's the alternative? Well, I highly recommend instead of spending that $2,500 on a diff lock, that you spend around the $400 to $500 mark and put a winch on the front of your four-wheel drive. Now, the obvious thing is that you need a bull bar. So if you don't have a bull bar, that's going to increase the cost of putting a winch onto your four-wheel drive. But a lot of four-wheel drives these days that are on the second-hand market already have a bull bar. So the true effect of a winch isn't just a practical one, but it's also a psychological effect as well. A winch gives you the confidence to know that if you're going to get yourself into a situation, you have the ability to get yourself out or get your mate out as well. So when it comes to the diff lock debate, the diff lock versus winch debate, I definitely lean onto the side of winches. Now, the difference between the two, a diff lock could get you into trouble, a winch is always going to get you out. So following on from the diff lock versus winch debate is traction control systems. Now, traction control systems in modern four-wheel drives were primarily designed to make vehicles safer on road. They can sense if an individual wheel locks up or spins faster than the other wheels, and the system then applies the brake or reduces the brake effort to that particular wheel to match the other wheels. Now, in a practical sense, when you're four-wheel driving, this also becomes an amazing thing, because if you're out bush and one of your tyres starts to lose traction, generally speaking, in an older four-wheel drive, all the power goes to that wheel without any traction. The one that has all the traction doesn't get any of the power. That's just how a traditional diff works. With a traction control system, once again, the system senses that wheel spin, brakes that wheel that doesn't have any traction, and then sends power to that other wheel that does have traction. And the effect of that is that you might even lift a bit of a wheel, spin a bit of a tyre off-road, and then you'll feel the system brake that wheel and start to claw the vehicle through. So modern traction control systems are another reason why I reckon modern vehicles are such a win. So question number 7, what size suspension lift do I need? Now, you probably noticed that this ute I've got here, it isn't the biggest, baddest thing in the world. It's got a 2-inch lift on it. And I reckon that a 2-inch lift is just about perfect for just about every four-wheel drive out there. Yeah, you can put bigger lifts on four-wheel drives, but they come at a cost, and that cost is the cost of supply and install of the parts, the questionable legality of lifting a vehicle more than 2 inches, and the need to go through expensive engineering processes to keep your four-wheel drive legal. And the truth is that a 2-inch lift on most four-wheel drives, especially on modern four-wheel drives that have those traction control systems, will get you about 98% of the places that bigger 3, 4, 5, 6-inch lifted vehicles will be able to go. And that last 2% of places, well, that's what you got your winch for. So when it comes to suspension lifts, I think you just can't go wrong with a 2-inch lift. It's a perfect all-rounder. Okay, so spares to take four-wheel driving with you, because being a good four-wheel driver is all about being prepared for just about any situation. Now the truth is, the majority of breakdowns that occur when you're four-wheel driving fall into some pretty basic categories. Basic stuff like fan belts that break, radiator hoses that leak. So I highly suggest doing yourself a favor, go and grab a full set of belts and hoses for your four-wheel drive and spend a lazy Sunday afternoon swapping them out in your driveway. And that does a couple of things. First thing it does is you learn how to do that in the comfort of your own driveway, not on the side of a track on a 38-degree day. That's a big bonus. And the second thing it does is those old belts and hoses you've pulled off your vehicle, chuck them in the back, chuck them under the seat. They're perfect spares. So other basic spares to take, general stuff, duct tape, electrical tape, hose clamps, cable ties, fencing wire is an excellent bit of gear too. Those kind of things will, generally speaking, help you rig up, and if not properly fix, then fix enough to get you back into town, any sort of breakages that you're generally going to come across. So, frequently asked question number 9. What would I not leave home without when I'm going four-wheel driving, apart from those spares that I just mentioned a moment ago? I did mention a couple of these earlier on, but they're worth reiterating because they're so important. A tyre deflator, so that you can lower your tyre pressures to suit your terrain. Hand in hand with that, an air compressor so you can pump your tyres back up when you're done four-wheel driving for the day. A snap strap and a couple of shackles as the absolute basic bits of recovery gear. That way, if you do get stuck, even if you're by yourself, if someone comes along, then you've got the gear to connect two four-wheel drives together and get yourself out again. A tyre repair kit is such a valuable bit of gear because whether you pick up a nail or a rock, any sort of puncture through the tread of the tyre, if you've got a tyre repair kit, then you can repair it, you can plug it. If you've got your air compressor, you can pump it back up again. And finally, an absolute essential for all modern four-wheel drive owners, a scanning tool like an engine data scan. These plug into your vehicle's OBD2 diagnostics port, and they allow you to read any engine check lights that come up, be able to read those error codes, clear them, get yourself out of limp modes, and also be able to read basic telemetry and engine diagnostics data. So the 10th and final question in this episode of Camping and Four-Wheel Driving Q&A is what things I wouldn't spend my money on if I was a beginner four-wheel driver just starting out. Now there's a heap of gear that you can chuck on your four-wheel drive to accessorize it, but here's the 5 things that I wouldn't put too high on the accessories list. The first one, as I mentioned before, is a diff lock. Yes, they're awesome bits of gear, but they are expensive, and I really reckon you're better off spending your money on a winch instead. Number 2 is a suspension lift that's more than 2 inches. Again, I did mention that a moment ago, but I just want to reiterate it. I think that a 2-inch suspension lift will get you almost everywhere, and if you have that winch, you'll get definitely everywhere. Number 3 ties into number 2, and that's really big tyres, and I mean tyres that are about more than 2 inches over your standard diameter. So if you've got a standard 31-inch tyre, I'd definitely go to a 33, but I wouldn't really think about going to anything that much bigger for the majority of four-wheel drivers, and again, definitely not if you're starting out. And staying on the topic of tyres, number 4, a second spare tyre. Now, unless you're going seriously remote, and I mean like not just crossing the Simpson Desert or doing Cape York type remote, I mean going to remote Northern Territory or WA cattle stations where you're 300 or 400 Ks off the track, I really don't think that you need a second spare tyre if you've got a set of 5 really good quality tyres, including a matching spare tyre. And if you have that matching spare tyre and you carry a tyre repair kit, you're gonna get yourself out of 99% of situations. So I don't think that a second spare tyre is that essential, especially because it will add weight and it'll roll into number 5. The 5th and final thing that I wouldn't spend my money on if I was starting out four-wheel driving is a rear bar. Now, rear bars are awesome bits of gear. They add a heap of protection to the rear of the vehicle, but they also add a heap of weight. And they're not the cheapest things out there either. You'll probably spend $3,000 or $3,500 and up putting a rear bar on most modern four-wheel drives. And one of the biggest reasons that most people put a rear bar on is to carry 2 spare tyres. So if you're not carrying that second spare tyre, then you're negating half of the reason for putting it on. Well, there we go. 10 frequently asked four-wheel driving questions answered. Hope you got a lot out of that. If you've got any other questions, ask them in the comments below. And remember, hit that notification button and the subscribe button so you stay in touch with us, because we're constantly hammering the channel with cracking camping and four-wheel driving tips, tricks and techniques. Catch you next time.